Jain. Today we will be examining a topic that sits at the intersection of international relation theory, diplomatic practice, and civilizational thought, indigenous philosophy and modern diplomacy. At first glance, diplomacy appears to be a highly institutionalized and procedural activity conducted by states governed by treaties and shaped by strategic interest. However, when we look more closely, we realize that diplomacy is also deeply influenced by ideas, values, and worldviews. The dominant framework through which diplomacy has been understood, particularly realism and liberalism, have largely emerged from Western historical experiences. These frameworks uh, assume certain things: that the international system is anarchic, that states are rational actors, and that power and security are the primary drivers of behavior. But what if these assumptions are not universal? What if these are alternative ways of understanding power, cooperation, and conflict? Way, Ways that are rooted in indigenous traditions across different parts of the world. This lecture seeks to explore precisely that. It asks a fundamental question: can indigenous philosophies reshape the practice and purpose of modern diplomacy in a meaningful way? So, let's start with the introduction. To answer this particular question, we must first situate diplomacy within the broader transformation of the contemporary international system. Today's global order is marked by complex interdependence, rising multipolarity, identity based conflicts, and transnational challenges such as climate change, pandemics, and cyber threats. These challenges do not fit neatly into traditional framework of state centric power politics. For instance, climate change cannot be addressed through military power or coercive diplomacy. Similarly, identity based conflicts cannot be resolved solely through political agreements. They require social reconciliation and trust building. This is where indigenous philosophies offer a different lens. They emphasize interconnectedness, ethical responsibility, and long term harmony rather than short term strategic gains. Moreover, there is a growing intellectual movement aimed at decolonizing international relations. This movement seeks to challenge the dominance of Western perspective and incorporates diverse voices and experiences into the study of global politics. Indigenous philosophy is central to this effort. It provides not just an alternative set of ideas, but a different way of thinking about knowledge itself. On that value, lived experience, oral tradition, and cultural context. Thus, the relevance of indigenous philosophy in diplomacy is not merely theoretical, it is deeply connected to the evolving needs of the global system. Moving further, now the question arises: what is indigenous philosophy? So, indigenous philosophy refers to system of thoughts that emerges from local cultures, traditions, and historical experiences. These systems are often transmitted through oral traditions, rituals, and community practices rather than formal written text. One of the key characteristics of indigenous philosophy is its holistic nature. Unlike Western thought, which often compartmentalizes different domains: politics, economics, environment, indigenous philosophies tend to view these domains as an interconnected. For example, in many indigenous traditions, the environment is not seen as an external source to be exploited, but as a living entity with intrinsic value. This perspective fundamentally alters how we approach issues like resource management and environmental diplomacy. Another important aspect is the emphasis on collective identity. While Western thought often prioritizes individual autonomy, indigenous philosophies tend to emphasize the role of the individual within a community. This does not mean that individuality is suppressed, but rather that it is understood in relations to others. The relational understanding has important implication for diplomacy, which is essentially about managing relationship. Finally, Indigenous philosophies often incorporates a strong ethical dimension. Actions are evaluated not just in terms of outcomes but also in terms of their moral implications and their impact on social harmony. So, what are the key features, or let us examine some of the defining features of indigenous philosophy in greater detail. The first is relational uh, thinking. Relational thinking in indigenous worldviews, relationships are central. This include relationship between individuals, between communities, between humans and nature, and between past, present and future generations. This perspective challenges the idea of actors as isolated units. Instead, it suggests that actions must be evaluated in terms of their impact on the broader network of relationship. The second feature is the community-centric approach. Decisions are often made collectively with an emphasis on consensus rather than majority rule. This ensures that decisions are more inclusive and legitimate. The third feature is a profound respect for nature. Many indigenous traditions view humans as a part of larger ecological system. This leads to a focus on sustainability and balance rather than exploitation. The fourth feature is prioritizing of ethics over power. While power is recognized, uh, it is not seen as the ultimate goal. Instead, the emphasis is on maintaining harmony and justice. These features collectively provides a framework that is fundamentally differ from the dominant paradigms of international relations. So, let us discuss the indigenous diplomacy, the concept which is linked to it. When these philosophical principles are applied to international relations, they give rise to what we can call indigenous diplomacy. Indigenous diplomacy differs from conventional diplomacy in several important ways. First, it emphasizes process over outcome. In conventional diplomacy, success is often measured in terms of agreement or concessions. In indigenous diplomacy, the focus is on equality, on the quality of the relationship and the sustainability of the outcome. Second, it prioritizes dialogue and consensus rather than adversarial negotiations. Indigenous diplomacy seeks to create a space for mutual understanding and collective decision making. Third, it incorporates a strong ethical dimension. Decisions are evaluated not just in terms of strategic advantage but also in terms of fairness, justice and long term impact. For example, in many indigenous conflict resolution practices, uh, the goal is not to defeat the opponent but to restore balance and rebuild relationship. This approach can be particularly effective in situations where trust has broken down. So, the historical roots of indigenous diplomacy can be found in diverse cultural contexts across the world. In many tribal societies, governance was based on council system where decisions were made through discussion and consensus. These councils often included elders who brought wisdom and experience to the decision making process. In Africa, the philosophy of Ubuntu, which can be understood as I am because we are, has influenced approaches to conflict resolution and governance. It emphasizes interconnectedness and shared humanity. In Native American tradition, diplomacy often involved ritual and symbolic exchanges such as the exchange of gifts and the use of storytelling to convey messages and build trust. In India, ancient texts such as the Arth Shastra and Dharma Shastra incorporated ideas of ethical governance and balance, reflecting a nuanced understanding of power and morality. These examples demonstrate that diplomacy has always been embedded in cultural and philosophical context rather than being a purely technical activity. So, moving further, let us discuss the indigenous philosophy in India. India provides a particularly rich example of the integration of indigenous philosophy into modern diplomacy. Concepts such as Dharma, Ahimsa, and Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam have played a significant role in shaping India's worldview. Dharma emphasizes duty, moral order, and ethical responsibility. It suggests that political actions must be guided by principle of justice and fairness. Ahimsa or non-violence is not merely a moral principle but also a strategic one. It was used effectively during India's independence movement and continued to influence its approach to conflict. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, meaning the world is one family, reflects a vision of global interconnectedness. It suggests that states should act not only in their own interest but also in the interest of the global community. These ideas have influenced India's foreign policy, particularly in areas such as peaceful coexistence, multilateralism, and humanitarian assistance. So, to fully appreciate the significance of indigenous diplomacy, it is important to contrast it with Western approaches. Western diplomacy, particularly in its realist form, is based on the assumption that an international system is anarchic in nature and that a state must prioritize their own survival and security, the survival of the fittest. This leads to the focus on power deterrence and strategic competition. Indigenous diplomacy, by contrast, emphasizes relationship, ethics, and collective well-being. It does not deny the existence of conflict, but it seeks to address it through dialogue and reconciliation. However, it would be incorrect to view these approaches as mutually exclusive. Mutually exclusive. In practice, modern diplomacy often requires a combination of both. The challenge lies in the finding a balance that allows for effective decision making while also promoting long term stability and cooperation. So, indigenous philosophies are increasingly being applied in modern diplomatic contexts. In conflict resolution, there is a growing recognition of the importance of local knowledge and community involvement. This has led to the adoption of more inclusive and participatory approaches. In environmental diplomacy, indigenous perspectives on sustainability are gaining prominence. Concepts such as ecological balance and stewardship are being incorporated into global framework. In development diplomacy, there is a shift toward inclusive and community based approaches reflecting indigenous principle of participation and equity. These applications demonstrate that indigenous philosophy is not just relevant but essential for addressing contemporary challenges. So, let us have a case study of India. India provides us several examples of how indigenous philosophy can be operationalized in diplomacy. India's use of soft power, including cultural diplomacy, reflects an effort to project its civilizational values. It, its development partnership emphasizes capacity building and mutual benefit rather than uh, conditional aid. India's humanitarian assistance, particularly in disaster relief, demonstrate a commitment to global responsibility and solidarity. These practices illustrate how indigenous philosophy can inform both the values and strategies of diplomacy. So, let us have a case study from world also from globe. So, globally, indigenous philosophies have influenced several important initiatives. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa used principles derived from Ubuntu to promote healing and reconciliation. Indigenous communities have played a key role in environmental advocacy, influencing international agreements. Grassroots peace building efforts often rely on local traditions and cultural practices, which are more effective in building trust. So, these examples highlight the practical value of indigenous approaches. So, how these indigenous perspectives are helpful in peace building? What are the role of it in peace building? In peace building, indigenous philosophy offers a distinct approach. It emphasizes restorative justice, which focuses on repairing harm and rebuilding relationship. It prioritizes long-term stability over short-term solutions, addressing the root cause of the conflict. This makes it particularly effective in post-conflict societies where sustainable peace requires more than just political agreements. So now, what are the challenges? Despite its despite its potential, indigenous philosophy uh, faces the several challenges. There is a dominance of Western framework, which often marginalize alternative perspectives. There is the lack of the risk of romanticization, where indigenous traditions are idealized without critical examination. Additionally, the realities of power politics can limit the effectiveness of ethical approaches. So, we have what is the relevance of this in today's scenario, today's world? Despite these challenges, indigenous philosophy is increasingly relevant. In addressing the climate crisis, it emphasizes on the sustainability is invaluable. In managing identity-based conflicts, its focus on dialogue and reconciliation provides effective solution. In a fragmented world, it offers a vision of unity and interconnectedness. So, let's critically evaluate the indigenous approach. If a critical approach is necessary, indigenous philosophy should be seen as a complementary framework, not as a replacement of Western or the other thoughts. It must be integrated thoughtfully, avoiding superficial use. The goal should be of pluralistic and inclusive diplomatic system. So, to conclude, indigenous philosophy enriches diplomacy by introducing ethical depth, relational thinking, and sustainability. It challenges dominant paradigms and open new possibilities. So, the future of diplomacy may well depend on our ability to integrate ancient wisdom with modern strategy. I am talking about to integrate ancient wisdom with the modern strategy. With this argument, I close this lecture here. Thank you.